It is my greatest pleasure and honor to introduce Professor Edmund Phelps, 2006 Nobel Laureate in Economic Sciences. Professor Edmund Phelps received his Bachelor of Arts degree at Amherst College in 1955 and his PhD at Yale in 1959. He joined the Department of Economics at Columbia in 1971 after several years at Pennsylvania and early at Yale. Columbia named him McVicker Professor of Political Economy in 1982. Professor Phelps was elected to the National Academy of Science in 1982 at the age of 48. He is also a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and of the Econometric Society. He has honorary doctorates from many universities and several honorary professorships from China. As an economic theorist, Professor Phelps is concerned with the imperfect knowledge and imperfect information of the market participants and with the effects their beliefs and expectations have on market outcomes. He is best known for introducing expectation-based microeconomics into a theory of employment determination and price-wage dynamics. He is instrumental in laying the micro-foundations for macroeconomics. In 2006, Professor Phelps was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economic Sciences for his analysis of intertemporal trade-offs in macroeconomic policy. In 2003, Princeton University Press published a 600-page festschrift in his honor titled Knowledge, Information, and Expectations in Modern Macroeconomics, paying tribute to his lifelong contribution to the study of macroeconomics. May I now invite Professor Phelps to ascend the stage to deliver his lecture on keys to endless economic development. Professor Phelps, please.
Thank you, Professor Liu. The title of my revised lecture is The Modern Economy, the Entrepreneur, and the Financier. What do I mean by the modern economy? I'm not the only person to have used the modern economy, the term modern economy in the way in which I use it, but nevertheless, I realize that there is more than one possible definition. Well, the traditional economy was the kind of rural private ownership economy prevailing in nearly every country in the world right through the 18th century. We think of it now as typically being in a stationary state, though possibly accompanied by the sort of economic vibrations that are studied in real business cycle theory, as some of you in this audience undoubtedly know. In contrast, the modern economy presents individuals with the possibility of undertaking innovations with the hope of making a profit. This kind of economy began to sprout up here and there in Western Europe beginning around 1960. The UK, the Netherlands, Germany, and the United States too. In any modern economy, knowledge of the future is severely incomplete. So what Frank Knight called uncertainty, as distinct from garden variety risk, what Frank Knight called uncertainty is prevalent. And in particular, when a business person undertakes a new action, makes a new decision, or a policy maker adopts a different policy rule, the evidence about what the results will be are ambiguous. So the entrepreneur or the policymaker can't be sure of what the consequences are of his or her action. A theme of my presentation is going to be that in such a modern economy, finance is hugely important for economic growth, for the rate of economic growth, and in particular for the rate and directions of innovation. Now, about the financial sector, the economic literature, I think, recommends three sources of benefits flowing from the financial sector, three functions of the financial sector, if you will. Perhaps the foremost function, though not very much is written about it, the foremost function of the financial sector is to select innovations for financing. I'll come back to this function later, but I want to comment first on the two more familiar functions that get a lot of attention. The first of these is is the one considered in most economic textbooks, namely there may be a demographic group, such as old people, who want to save more than they want to invest, while younger people want to invest more than they want to save. So the financial sector has the function of taking the excess saving from the one group and financing, and with that financing the excess investment demand of the other group. The other classical function of the financial sector, recognized and studied at some length in some economic texts, is the function of intermediating between savers with varying degrees of risk aversion and investment projects with heterogeneous prospects for risk and for rate of return. These two functions recognized in the textbooks are, seems to me fair to say, mechanical and cut and dried, reliable. There's no uncertainty about these activities of the financial sector. The first economic theorist to adopt this view of the financial sector was, paradoxically, none other than Joseph Schumpeter, whom many beginning students in economics understand to be the author of the theory of capitalism. But in fact, Schumpeter had a long way to go. He left a lot to be said about how capitalism works. In particular, many economists continue to believe that technology is the driving force behind economic growth. This has led to the single-minded emphasis in France, for example, on government research projects and government subsidies to research in the business sector. In the United States, also, some policymakers and policy advisors give an almost sacred place to scientific research and to corporate R&D. My colleague at Columbia, the American economist Richard Nelson, has referred to this as a techno-fetish, the fetish of research expenditure. Even Schumpeter, rudimentary as his views of capitalism were, even Schumpeter did not agree with that view. Schumpeter argued that mere technical progress is not sufficient for most economic growth in the world. Schumpeter's thesis was this: technological advances open up the possibility of commercial advances, which Schumpeter called innovations. But such innovations will not take place without the Schumpeterian entrepreneur, as we now call him, to assemble the resources needed to develop the innovation. Well, we can agree that technical progress is not sufficient for innovation, and yet at the same time see that Schumpeter's understanding of the process of innovation is very old-fashioned, very limited. The modern view of innovation is that business people are the inventors or creators of most commercial innovations, successful ones and failed ones. An implication of this modern view is that technical progress is not necessary for commercial innovation. Not just not sufficient, but not necessary. And I would be inclined to strongly agree. We have plenty of technology to support myriad commercial innovations for centuries to come. Much of innovation, by the way, is artistic more than it's scientific, although, of course, artists often draw upon existing technology, some of it centuries old, and some of it sometimes just a year or two earlier. The cornerstone of this modern theory was laid by the economist Friedrich Hayek, the most celebrated member of the Austrian school. Hayek said that in the modern economy, one that was constantly changing and becoming more and more complex and specialized, every owner and every employee, for that matter, has an enormous amount of private knowledge about his business or his job. Private knowledge that comes about from his particular, generally highly specialized experience in the business world. Well, Hayek, in his early work in the 1930s, when he was out to attack socialism, and in 1940s, when he was out to attack Europe's corporatism, Hayek seldom, if ever, mentioned innovation. But in the 1960s, he did get around to it. And I think if you read Hayek of the 1960s, you can see that his conception is that out of the private knowledge of a person with experience and powers of observation in the business world, out of that private knowledge, a new commercial idea of originality is apt to come. An idea that other people do not have, since they don't have all the pieces of experience and pieces of knowledge on which the idea is based. Now, you might say, well, gee, where does this notion of private knowledge come from, and is there any support for it? Well, it's true that applied econometricians are not routinely generating regression analyses, measuring and explaining and quantifying private knowledge. But there is a ton of anecdotal evidence of private knowledge. I like, there was a column in the Wall Street Journal a couple of years ago in which the reporter said that he or she, I don't remember, had gotten on the elevator and saw a delivery man with his arms full of FedEx or DHL packages. And just to make conversation with the deliveryman, the reporter said, "Say, is it best to deliver the packages from the top story down, or is it best to deliver them from starting with the bottom floor and working your way up?" And without a moment's hesitation, the delivery man shot back, "Depends on the time of day." It's interesting that even to have had that insight is kind of a little bit striking, and to have been so, I mean, to have thought about that is really quite unusual or interesting or arresting, and to have had such a precise notion of how it was, what would be the comparative experience of starting from the top, starting at the bottom, is somewhat impressive. Well, this theory of innovation that comes out of Hayek is sometimes called a bottom-up theory of innovation. The innovative ideas come bubbling up from little people, sometimes even at the lowest rungs of the economic ladder. And this notion of top-down innovation, and Hayek's attack on top-down economies was fueled later, rather more than in the in his first attacks, was later fueled by this point that an economy doesn't get anywhere if it relies on the leader to decide on what innovations to pursue. The leader has no on-the-ground experience of the business world on which to make good judgments and have good intuitions about what the prospects might be for this or that consumption. Now I come to finance. In the modern economy, it's the financial sector that we depend upon for making the choices of which entrepreneurial projects to back and which entrepreneurial projects to reject. But we can't grasp what it's like to be a financier until we understand that the financier is living in a modern economy in which there's uncertainty and ambiguity, and even the entrepreneur himself, humbly applying for financial support, even the entrepreneur himself is undoubtedly uncertain as to what the prospects of his or her proposed innovation will be. Now, many analysts of entrepreneurship and many analysts of innovation, let's put it that way, tend to stop either at the entrepreneur, or maybe they mention both the entrepreneur and the financier and let it go at that. But in fact, there's a complex of mechanisms involved in the innovation process. The Hayekian entrepreneur, let me put it another way, the Hayekian innovator, the guy with the idea, requires a manager able to organize the development of an innovative idea. The development of an innovative idea generally requires a financier to provide adequate funding to cover the required outlay. I was mentioning that before. Achieving commercial success for the new product or new method, once it's developed, requires somebody to market it, generally a specialized marketer. China, I understand, is not well set up to support marketing activity, which is, if true, is something that is probably holding back innovation, or more likely, or especially holding back the success rate of innovations. Finally, to be commercially successful, innovations require consumers venturesome enough, experienced enough, educated enough to be able to evaluate a new consumer product, and venturesome enough to be willing to adopt a new product once examined. Likewise, an innovation to be adopted, let's say an intermediate product like fertilizer or something like that, for that to be adopted by companies or farmers, that's going to require at least some pioneering adopters who have the education that gives them the confidence that they can evaluate the new fertilizer, and they have to have the courage to be willing to take a chance. So innovation is a system. It's not just it's not just entrepreneurship. It's not even entrepreneurship plus financiership. In all these stages, a key difficulty is that the benefit of a new commercial idea is not known beforehand. Even the Hayekian originator or entrepreneur cannot know. Likewise, the cost of developing a new idea cannot be known beforehand. It may prove to be a steeper uphill climb than was appreciated at the beginning. This would typically might be the rather typical case. I was reading a commentator not long ago who said that one reason we see entrepreneurs making such heroic efforts to get their new idea developed, and you wonder why on earth they did that, it's because they greatly underestimated what the difficulties were going to be, and eventually they got so heavily emotionally invested in the project that they were determined to carry it out. But they might not have done that had they had a more realistic estimate of the development costs. Likewise, I've never known a book author who didn't underestimate by at least a factor of a half how long it would take him to finish his book. So the financial sector has the fundamental task of trying to judge benefit and cost for each of the innovative projects that are candidates for financing. So the decision to finance a project is just as essential as the creation of the new idea. So a deficiency of financiership can be just as fatal as a deficiency of entrepreneurship. What then are the elements of a fully articulated, healthy financial system? Well, we could never deduce such a thing just a priori. That would be quite an incredible feat if one could do that. That could be done. The best that we can do is look around and see what features appear to be common to the 2, 3, 4, or whatever economies that apparently have a good financial system. And one of these is the presence of angel investors as the source of finance in the first stage of the development of an innovation. The angel investor will typically be a former entrepreneur who has the confidence, who's gained the confidence through his own experience to be willing to rely on his judgment and, in some cases, make a decision to invest his own money. And then, of course, he can mentor the entrepreneur, give him the benefit of his experience. At that point, they're in the same boat together. Venture capitalists come along in the second stage, in which financial requirements have become much larger than the angel can handle. Finally, a variety of other financial arrangements come into play after the venture capitalist has come and gone. And here there are familiar issues of the stock market as a way to finance new products, new methods, companies with newly developed product, a newly developed product or newly developed method, versus stock market versus bank finance. And then there's also public corporation versus private corporation, stock market versus private equity in today's terminology. I don't want to go very far at all in the direction of suggesting reforms, financial reforms for the Asian economy. But I can't resist saying one thing, though, and that is that the finance system in Western continental Europe appears to be a very poor model for Asia to emulate. Indigenous startup entrepreneurs in continental Europe are not well served by Europe's entrenched banks, the Landesbanken in Germany and the savings banks in Italy. So Asia is wise and will continue to be wise if it does not go down this medieval corporatist road that continental Europe went back to in the interwar years in the 1920s and 1930s. Now, I want to just make comments upon two issues of the day, so to speak. What does all this mean for trade, for example? Do we need to understand the modern economy? Do we need to understand the modern economy to understand trade? I think it's absolutely at the heart of trading patterns and what gets exported, what gets imported. I think that the financial sector is integral to the directions that innovation goes, and the directions in which innovation go are central to determining where a country's comparative advantages will lie, in what industries it's going to be able to export. When China and the United States opened up to trade in around 1980, what did China export and the U.S. import from China? It was those goods that the United States had not, relatively speaking, made big technical advances in the production of, like garments. So the United States had a comparative advantage in those industries where it had made profound technical advances over 100 years or more, which left China with its comparative advantage in those industries where the United States had not made technical advances. So that technological or innovational, that innovational theory of comparative advantage is, I think, more applicable to the world of today than David Ricardo's natural resources theory of where comparative advantage lies. I'd just like to, the last application I want to make of this is in the area of monetary policy, thinking of the United States in particular. Once we start thinking of the modern economy, as I've defined it here, it becomes quickly clear that fixed mechanical interest rate rules or inflation targeting rules cannot work well because the structure of the economy is constantly changing. The natural unemployment rate is swinging from one level in boom times to another level when the economy is in the doldrums and there's not much job creation coming from development of innovations and marketing and all that. And since there are big swings in business activity connected with waves of innovation, the natural real rate of interest is also swinging perhaps widely from a high level to a low level or from a low level to a high level. So it makes no sense for the central bank, such as the Federal Reserve, makes no sense to think in terms of gearing the real interest rate in some fixed way to the unemployment rate and to the inflation rate, because the common sense of the interest rate rule is that you want the real interest rate in relation to the natural real rate of interest to be geared to the unemployment rate in relation to the natural rate of interest and in relation to the natural rate of unemployment. But the natural real rate of interest and the natural unemployment rate are floating. They're not strongly anchored to long-run fixed levels. So we need, just as we need entrepreneurs and financiers who have intuition and judgment, likewise in the policy arena, we need policymakers who possess and are free to exercise their judgment and their intuition. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Phelps, for sharing with us your words of wisdom. Professor Phelps has kindly agreed to take a few questions from the audience. May I again invite Professor Liu Pak-Wai to moderate the question and answer session. Professor Liu, please.
Thank you, Professor Phelps, for the stimulating lecture on financing innovation and modern economy. Now the floor is open for questions.
Hello, Professor Phelps. My name is Kay Lau. I'm a history graduate student of Chinese University. You mentioned earlier about the top-down versus bottom-up way of innovation, and you mentioned that if leaders impose top-down policies, then there's very little chance of success. I think we have some controversy in Hong Kong in the last few years where one thing is like the cyber port, where the government has gone into suggest that we develop the IT industry, and it has been less than successful. And also been suggestions about building the science park, and also a lot of controversy about that. What would you suggest, like to the government here, the administration, that you have a lot of enthusiasm, they have some dispensable money. What should be the best way of initiating innovation in a situation like Hong Kong?
I had some problems hearing parts of that. The last part of it was, what should be the best way to initiate innovations in an economy like Hong Kong? Can you help me with the
I
first
think
part of it?
I'm trying to understand that too. Whether the government should play a strong role in initiating or financing or supporting innovations and technology, as Hong Kong government tries to do in some times. Obviously, Singapore government is very big on that.
Oh, yeah, okay.
As opposed to a
Okay.
bottom-up approach.
Okay, yeah, okay. It's a sort of a Singapore question. Yeah. You may not be satisfied with my answer. I will understand it if you're not. But, you know, in the United States, let me give you an analogy. In the United States, it's widely believed, it's probably correct too, but that doesn't matter. It's widely believed that the strength of the tertiary education system, the university system, the college system in the United States is attributable in significant part because private ownership, private management of colleges and universities was so important, especially early in the history of the education system. So the argument is private universities are better. The state universities are more bureaucratic, less forward-looking, et cetera, et cetera. Now, a person could always say, well, but professor, what about the University of California? Doesn't that disprove your point? There we have a university with a brilliant research record, and obviously a very good record of educating massive numbers of people decade after decade after decade. So doesn't that prove that state universities can be just as good as private universities? Well, yes, it does prove that in the distribution of it does prove that there exist a handful of state-owned universities that are just as good as most private universities. But it doesn't prove that the central tendency, the mean, that the mean performance of state universities is as good as the mean performance of private universities. There are, after all, deviations from the mean. There are all sorts of influences that are captured in the disturbance terms in statistical analyses. That's why we do statistics, because we recognize that there are variations around means. Likewise, when you raise the interesting question about Singapore, I'm inclined to say that Singapore may be the exception, as Singapore just seems to be very talented at, seems to be able to push to the fore people with a real talent, an unusual talent for guiding the economy to some extent toward new opportunities, and you wonder whether they could do as well under an unguided system of entrepreneurial capitalism. And maybe they couldn't. I don't know. But I wouldn't generalize too much from that experience. I mean, I wouldn't say, oh, right, okay, Singapore does fine, so let's urge that every country in the world, at least every small country in the world, put its innovation mechanisms under the control of a state financial authority rather than a private financial sector. I think that would be betting against the odds. That would not be such a strategy would not be well supported by the historical statistical record.
Further questions? Yes, sir.
Thank you, Professor. My question is about the subprime mortgage crisis. Because in your presentations, finance is so important to the modern economy. It gives the lifeblood for the economy to thrive. But from the case of the subprime mortgage crisis, we can see the financial market can be a double-edged sword that can enable the rocket expert to create some fraudulent financial products to cheat the investor, such as the CLO and CDO crisis. They just repackage the debts, the mortgage debts, into some AAA rank bonds and sells to the investor. And this kind of development jeopardizes the world economy. How would you offer any insights to the subprime mortgage crisis? Thank you.
There are probably 10 good things to say about that matter. I won't be able to think of them all in a short space of time. Of course, I mean, I do think that throwing these subprime mortgages into a package of assets, securitizing them, in other words, like putting a few rotten apples in the barrel, hoping that the number of apples that are rotten will be small enough not to be noticed. Of course, that's an unattractive, even reprehensible practice, but there's probably nothing that we can do about that. There are regulations, truth in packaging regulations. There are regulations about sell-by dates so that you can't sell last year's produce in the grocery store as if it was fresh produce. I mean, so that probably there's a role for regulation here when it comes to securitization. And then there probably is going to be room for a little regulation of the rating authorities, more regulation than there is now. But I think that it will also, the system will, to some extent, find it has incentives to reform itself if it wants to go on being in business. So there are financial firms that found it convenient to invest in asset-backed securities. And there are banks that liked reaching out to submarginal borrowers. Of course, many people, you know, were very excited to learn that for the first time in their life they could buy a house, and they wouldn't even have to start their mortgage payments for a year or two. A lot of people got lucky with this innovation, and a lot of people have, in the financial sector, have made a decent amount of income with it. So I think that there will be incentives in the industry to take precautions as best they can to prevent another debacle in the future. Just what innovations they'll come up with to create more transparency, better ratings and so forth? I don't know. I'm not on the ground. I'm not an insider in that. But, you know, generally speaking, whenever there's been a financial crisis, the financial industry has come together and created some new conventions, some new arrangements, so that that problem will not recur. But of course, there'll be new problems, novel problems that will crop up later, and you know, here we go again. We'll have another crisis. That can't be prevented. As long as the system, as long as the financial system is free to innovate, just like the business sector is free to innovate, there are going to be the occasional crisis and fluctuation. But by the way, I don't think that the reason for the U.S. downturn is primarily the subprime mortgage problem. The downturn was unquestionably already in the works 6-9 months ago, with the beginning of a weakening of housing starts, the beginning of a slowdown in business investment, the rise in the price of oil. I mean, it's very hard to think of any good news that has struck the U.S. economy in the past 6 or 9 months. It's almost all bad news, and when you add all that up, I think you have to come to the conclusion that the boom coming from commercial opportunities to commercialize the internet, that boom is now finally winding down, and the natural unemployment rate, which was excited to and driven down to a very low level by the massive investments going on over the past 10 or 12 years, that's coming to an end, and the natural unemployment rate is going to go back to more familiar territory. I won't speculate as I won't give a number, but it's going to look. It's not going to be the same low level that it was for 10 or 12 years.
We have time just for one last question. Is that? Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Phelps. I just want to ask, you just mentioned that one country's financial innovation and financial development is amenable to one country's economic growth, and just more or less the same like what McKinnon said in the year 1976. But recently, empirical research in the China and India's experience clearly provides some counterexamples of the positive relations between one country's financial innovation and economic growth, since China and India has the fastest economic growth in the world recently, but their financial market and their banking system are relatively undeveloped. Nevertheless, their firms can find other informal financing resources and other governance mechanisms to sustain their prosperity. What do you think?
Because of the echo, I couldn't hear the question very well, but I heard that it was about China and India, so I think I can guess what it was about. I think the question was, forgive me if I get it wrong, but let me just do the best I can with it. I think the question is, well, what about China and India? They don't have the world's most sophisticated, articulated, well-functioning financial system in the world, and yet they're growing at record rates. Those economies are enjoying record rates of growth of productivity. So what do we make of that? Well, you know, when you do a statistical analysis of growth rate of productivity in countries in relation to the level of productivity attained by the current time, you get a downward sloping relationship. The lower the productivity level at the current time, the higher the growth rate tends to be. In other words, there tends to be a modified kind of convergence in growth rates, it's sometimes called. I think, so you can't think about Chinese growth and India growth in the same way that you would think about such a growth rate if it happened to develop in Germany. If Germany had 11% productivity growth year after year after year, we would be utterly amazed and would have to tear up volumes of economic literature and start all over again to try to understand this miracle. But when countries are starting from an extremely low level of productivity, it would be the miracle is rather how come some of them don't grow fast when they are starting from such low productivity levels. The so-called growth miracles in Europe after World War II, more precisely between 1955 and 1980, were not really miracles. They should have been predicted because productivity levels in Germany, France, and Italy had fallen to about 45 to 50% of the US level by 1955. They were still falling between 1945, the end of the war, and 1955, because the United States was growing unusually rapidly between 1945 and 1955. So there was no miracle there. It's normal to have very rapid growth when productivity levels are high. So I think that, to come back to the question, I think that there's every reason to hope that China and India will continue to grow very rapidly for years and years to come. But in order to do that, they're going to have to continue to make reforms in their economic systems. Otherwise, they will hit barriers and not be able to go on. And certainly the financial sector, I would think that the financial sector is one of the most critical sectors in this process of catch-up with the West. And then China and India will never be able to catch up fully with the US and the other countries with very high productivity, Ireland, Luxembourg, so forth and so on. They'll never be able to catch up unless their financial systems also catch up.
Well, thank you for sharing us with your insights. Thank you for the lecture.